Welcome to part 2 of this discussion on our starter motor from the 2004 Yamaha 90 4-stroke. In part 1 we took it off the boat, and now what we want to do is check to see whether there is, when a direct electrical charge is applied, whether this thing will actually spin. We talked a little bit about the fact that there's probably multiple points of concern that would keep this thing from spinning hard enough to engage the engine and turn it over. What we were seeing, as we mentioned, is you'd turn the key and you'd hear a click, and the pinion gear, it looks like, would rise and connect with the ring gear on the crank, and then stop. Now that might sound like a classic weak battery, although there was none of the click 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 that you would hear. So I don't know that that was an issue. Even after charging the battery up, it would still have trouble starting. One of the things that the solenoid does, in addition to complete the circuit when receiving a 12-volt signal between the battery and the starter, so you don't have, high amperage lines going up to your ignition. So it does that, but it also, on other starters, will activate a plunger inside, which pushes the ring gear, the pinion gear upwards. I don't know whether this solenoid does that. What you'll see is when you spin this in the direction of rotation, it wants to lift out of its housing on its own. I don't know whether it's supposed to do that or whether in fact there is some kind of activator in here, but we'll see that when we open it up. So let's apply some juice and see what happens. So what we'll do is attach the positive lead to the positive terminal on the solenoid, not this one, because this is upline of the starter, and inside the solenoid should be an open switch right now, and it's this signal from the ignition that causes the switch to close and transfer the energy out that terminal and into the starter. So just because these things are so close here, I think what we'll do is connect the positive to the back here, and then to test it, touch the body of the starter with the negative, or the ground. In fact, that allows us to do it a little more accurately. So let's turn this on and see what happens here. Alright, so that's turning, but it's not extending, and I don't know whether that's just a function of how we're testing it. It's probably not the best to create that kind of spark, but at least we know that the basic mechanics of turning the starter are working. So now I think what we need to do is get inside here and take a look at the conditions of the brushes, assuming they're serviceable, and how easy this mechanism works. So you can see here that the solenoid does in fact have a plunging mechanism, which perhaps isn't working. And so inside, you can see that there's definitely a connection between raising, pushing that out, and the plunger here. It's possible it's not working inside here somewhere, so we'll get into that as well. Here's a closer look at this end of the solenoid. So this plunger actually isn't pushing out, it's pulling in. So when it's energized, I'm assuming that plunger pulls in. There's quite a lot of tension on that. There's probably a big spring inside. So energy is applied, plunger pulls in, circuit energizes the starter. As the plunger pulls inwards, you can see there's a hole in the end of it here. That hole is is connected to that plastic plunger, and what happens is, as it pulls downwards, the pinion goes out. Pinion gear goes out. Engine starts, ignition's released. Magnet, this is probably a magnet of some kind, releases the plunger, which pushes it then back forward, pulling the ring gear or the pinion gear inwards. Unfortunately, I did not see before I disconnected it, which is my bad, whether this was actually engaged. It fell apart so easily. I'm wondering whether this this possibly dropped out and is not connected to this, because that might explain why our starter spins, but the pinion gear doesn't extend. So one way we can test that is by applying 12 volts to this to see whether it in fact pulls that in. So let's try that next. All right, so let's just review what we want to test here. Our first test was of the starter motor itself, the windings inside, the fact that it would spin. So when we attached voltage, introduced voltage through the base of the solenoid that was already connected to the starter and grounded the starter, it spun. So that would seem to indicate that the basic function of the motor is fine in here. Now what we're interested in finding out is the solenoid pulling back and creating that forward movement of the pinion gear to engage. In order to do that, we need to both introduce 12 volts to the base of the solenoid, but we also need to introduce 12 volts to the signal wire, because that is what's going to tell the internals of the solenoid to close the switch and activate the magnet, presumably it's a magnet, that pulls that in. So we've got our 12 volt positive connection here, and we'll introduce the ground to the body. Now you can see there's a spark. The connection is being made, but the plunger isn't going in, nor is there a click. Now, it's possible that a I've got this backwards, and that what I'm doing is introducing the energy to the downline component of the solenoid. So I'm just going to switch real quick and set it up again and test that. So nothing's happening no matter which terminal I connect this to, and with the signal wire activated. I think what I will do is put it back in the starter and test it with this connector here, just to make sure that there isn't an issue with my grounding here, although this is a pretty heavy chunk of metal. I know it's painted, but I would have thought that that would go through anyway. So we'll put it back together. The other thing I discovered is that I think the plunger was engaged, because when I try to turn this now and rotate the starter, I can do it. This action happens much more easily, which makes me think that when the starter was together, that this plunger was in fact engaged, because it took quite a bit to pull it out, working against that. All right, so let's quickly put it back together, test it again using the signal wire, because we know the motor is spinning, at least the times we've tried it. It's possible that maybe it's got an intermittent fault in here, but we'll put it back together, test it in place, and then if the plunger, we can't get the plunger to come out, we know there's at least a problem here, but we still might want to take a look inside here. Okay, so now we've got tension back on the plunger, and the starter still spins freely. So we won't attach those two yet. Actually, I think we do need to attach those two. So we're going to put this back on to feed the energy to the starter, as well as give the solenoid an opportunity to engage. Make sure that doesn't short out. Alright, so solenoid back in place. Now, because we want to test the functionality of the solenoid, we need to introduce that 12 volts to the signal wire, as well as the main power that allows the starter to rotate. What we're going to do then is just introduce the ground to the body. What we're wanting to see is that not only does it spin, but there's a healthy click and it forces the pinion out. And then, when the power is disconnected, we want to see that pull it back in. So that test was both a success and a failure, because it behaved exactly as it should. The solenoid closed the switch to the starter, it energized the plunger, pulled it in, which then levered the pinion out. It spun until the power was removed, and then it pulled itself back in. At first I thought it may have been sticking, like as it spun to a stop, and then dropped, but I don't know enough about what normal looks like on one of these things, so it definitely had a positive return though. So it was interesting that we found it partially engaged with the flywheel, which would have actually been at the end of the start cycle, not the beginning. So, as with all intermittent electrical issues, a little more pondering required. I happen to have the boat battery here as well, so I think one of the things we need to do is charge that up, take a load reading, make sure that's good, and then the other issue is, as mentioned in part 1, there may be some wiring in other areas of the boat that we need to investigate. It's possible we've got an intermittent issue at the ignition switch up at the helm, or some other issue, but for the moment this is behaving just as it should. So I don't think we'll take this apart for now. I'll probably take this off again and lubricate that arm, just because some of it comes off on your hands when you pull it out. I do find it interesting that, you know, such a heavy-duty component as this has what looks like a nylon actuating arm in the middle, which would seem to me an invitation to, you know, wear out of spec, where that plunger goes through that nylon hole. But, you know, perhaps it's just a way of keeping it moving freely. The nylon against the metal plunger, less opportunity for corrosion to set in the marine environment between the two. If it was another metal component, and plastic will always slide along metal fairly well, of course, until it wears through. That doesn't seem like it's our issue at the moment. It was definitely a inability for the starter to engage and rotate the engine. So I think we'll leave this at the moment and start looking at the condition of the battery and some other wiring with the boat. Anyway, thanks for watching. Thoughts definitely welcome, and we will just continue.